You know, we spend so much of our lives assuming that our greatest misery, like our absolute deepest tragedy, is failing to get exactly what we want.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We pray and we strive and we just wait for that one big breakthrough.
Right. But as I was looking over the notes from this week's sermon by our pastor, a completely different and honestly a pretty startling question was raised.
I know exactly the one you mean. It really caught me off guard.
Yeah, it was this idea of, well, what if our greatest tragedy isn't failing to get what we want? What if our greatest tragedy is actually getting everything we want, but, you know, getting it without God?
It's just a terrifying shift in perspective. And honestly, that's exactly why we wanted to do a deep dive into the pastor's notes this week.
Yeah, story.
We're specifically looking at that really bizarre story in Numbers chapter 11 today. Because, well, on the surface, it's an ancient account about people eating way too much quail in a desert.
Right, which just sounds weird to us now.
It does. But underneath all that, it is a mirror held right up to our own hearts. It forces us to ask what we are actually chasing and what happens when we finally catch it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to judge Israel's failure in the wilderness, I mean, we first have to look at the universal human condition that we all share.
Yeah, that moving target of happiness.
Exactly. We all do it. We tell ourselves, you know, if I just get that job, I'll be happy. Or if I can just afford that house, I will finally have peace.
Or even, if my child gets into that specific college, I won't ask for another thing.
Yes. But then, as the pastor shared with us, something very strange happens. We get the thing, and the miracle, well, it quickly becomes an expectation.
Psychologists actually have a term for that mechanism. It's called the hedonic treadmill.
The hedonic treadmill, wow.
Yeah, so basically we experience this massive spike in dopamine when we finally achieve a goal or acquire a new possession, but our brains are wired to adapt.
So the thrill just kind of wears off.
Exactly. That heightened state of joy just normalizes. So to feel that exact same level of happiness again, we need something bigger. Something newer. The baseline just keeps shifting on us.
That makes so much sense of the analogy from the pastor's message about, you know, getting your very first paycheck.
Oh, I loved that analogy.
Me too, because I still vividly remember my first one. I felt so rich and honestly so incredibly grateful. It felt like a literal miracle that a company handed me money for my time.
But you fast forward a few years.
Right. You fast forward and getting paid just feels utterly ordinary. It's expected. If it's a day late, I'm annoyed, I'm not grateful, I'm just mad.
Yeah, and that exact same psychological adaptation happens with our health, with our marriages, our kids, and even with our church life.
It's like the blessing simply becomes the background noise of our lives.
Which anchors us directly into the emotional state of the Israelites in Numbers 11. I mean, they were not actually starving.
No, not at all.
Right. God was faithfully providing manna every single day. There was plenty to eat. Their nutritional needs were entirely met. But they were gripped by something else entirely.
The craving.
Yes. The text says they had a craving. And the Hebrew word used there is avah.
Avah. Okay, what does that actually mean in this context?
Well, it doesn't mean experiencing physical hunger. It describes an intense, wanton, consuming craving that absolutely grips the soul.
Oh, wow.
It's a desire that morphs into a demand, and ultimately it turns into an idol.
So it wasn't about a lack of food at all. It was a complete lack of satisfaction with what God had already provided.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, as the pastor did so beautifully, we see this exact same behavioral pattern all the way back in the Garden of Eden.
Oh, right. I remember that part of the message.
Yeah, when you examine Genesis 2, God gave Adam and Eve permission to eat from hundreds, maybe thousands of trees. The environment was just pure abundance.
Just absolute perfection.
But Satan's tactic was incredibly subtle. He didn't focus on the vast provision they'd been freely given. He magnified the one single tree they lacked.
He shifted their focus from the 99% they had to the 1% they didn't have?
Exactly.
And that seems to be the very origin point of sin. It begins when the wonder of our present blessings fades, you know, when complaining takes root, and we become entirely obsessed with the one thing we do not possess.
It completely reframes what the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 6.6.
How so?
Well, our culture insists that having more money or more success is the ultimate gain. But Paul says that true gain is actually godliness with contentment. True wealth is simply knowing that God himself is enough.
Yeah, it's so profound. But, this raises an important question for me, and it really gets to the core of how we view God's sovereignty.
Okay, let's hear it.
We almost always view a no from God as a disappointment, right? And a yes as a blessing. But as the pastor shared with us, God will sometimes protect us by saying no, and he can actually judge us by saying yes.
Yes, that is such a sobering thought.
It is. When our desires become idols, when we essentially say to God, I must have this thing to be happy, even if it's outside your will, the most terrifying thing God can do is hand us over to that desire. He steps back and says, okay, have it.
And that is exactly what happens in Numbers 11.
I have to admit, though, I really struggled with this part of the message.
Really? Why is that?
Well, I found myself actively wrestling with this idea of God judging us by giving us what we want. Because Jesus explicitly tells us, ask and it will be given to you.
Right.
So there is absolutely nothing wrong with asking God for things. He tells us to bring our requests to him. So how in the world are we supposed to know the difference?
That's a great point.
How do I know if my prayer for a promotion or a new relationship is a good, healthy desire, or if it's a craving that's going to ruin me?
I think the difference lies in what happens to our faith if the answer is no.
Oh, that's good.
If a denied request destroys your faith or leads to bitter resentment against God, it reveals that the request wasn't just a desire. It was a demand. It was an idol.
Because it became the ultimate thing.
Exactly. And that leads to the terrifying yes from God.
Let's look at the astonishing and frankly overwhelming picture painted in verse 31.
The quail.
Yes, the quail. God actually grants their complaining request. He sends a wind that brings quail from the sea. But it's not just a small flock passing through.
It's massive.
The text says the quail cover the landscape for a day's journey in every single direction. And they're piled up 2 cubits high. That's roughly 3 feet of birds, covering miles and miles of desert in every direction.
The visual is staggering. It's almost suffocating to just imagine it.
It really is.
But what really caught my attention was the sheer unrestrained gluttony of the people's response. In verse 32, it notes that the person who gathered the least amount of quail collected 10 homers.
10 homers. Yeah, and to put that into perspective, a homer is roughly the amount a single donkey can carry. So the person who was the least enthusiastic, the person who gathered the smallest amount of meat, still gathered 10 donkey loads of it.
That's insane.
It had nothing to do with gathering a single meal for their family. It was desire entirely without restraint.
They were trying to fill a spiritual void with physical consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And the aftermath is incredibly solemn.
The plague, right?
Yes. The scripture tells us that while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was even fully consumed, a great plague struck the people.
Wow.
The psalmist reflects on this exact moment centuries later in Psalm 106, verse 15, and provides this haunting summary of the event. He says, he gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul.
Sent leanness into their soul. So what does this all mean? What does a lean soul practically look like for you and me today?
What do you think it looks like?
To me, it feels like spiritual malnutrition. It's like eating cotton candy for every single meal.
Oh, that's a perfect way to describe it.
Right. You feel completely stuffed, you're consuming massive amounts of calories, but your body is literally starving to death because there are absolutely zero nutrients.
Exactly. A lean soul is the person who accumulates mass amounts of wealth, but never actually finds a single moment of peace.
Or the person who gets busier and busier with important things, achieving more and more success, until that success subtly, quietly takes God's place in their life.
Their resume is absolutely bursting, but their spirit is completely withered.
That analogy of empty calories perfectly captures the mechanism at work here. We stuff ourselves with the world, hoping it will nourish us, and we end up spiritually starved.
Which makes the analogy the pastor shared so profoundly moving. Think of a loving parent.
The toddler analogy.
Yeah. If a screaming toddler is in the kitchen, begging for a sharp knife, throwing an absolute tantrum on the floor, demanding it with everything they have, does a loving parent give it to them?
Absolutely not.
No matter how much the child cries, the parent will withhold the knife. Because they have the perspective to know it will cause destruction, even if the child thinks it's a fun toy.
Even if the child screams, you don't love me, you never give me what I want, the parents know is actually proof of their deep love.
Yes. Sometimes what we perceive in the moment as a closed door or an agonizingly silent heaven is actually God's deepest, most profound mercy.
That is so comforting, actually.
Consider the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. He pleaded with God 3 separate times to remove his thorn in the flesh. We don't know exactly what it was, but it was agonizing for him.
And God's answer was no.
Right. His answer was, no, my grace is sufficient for you. Paul's desperate prayer was denied, but because of that denial, he received something far greater.
The sustaining daily grace of God.
Exactly. Which kept his soul dependent and prevented it from ever becoming lean.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When you look at the sheer destruction of that unrestrained craving for the quail, it really makes you wonder what they were so desperate to escape.
Right. What were they running from?
They traded everything for this meat, which means they must have deeply despised what they were already eating. We often completely ignore the miracles that are sitting right in front of us.
We really do.
Let's look closely at verses 7 and 8. The manna wasn't just basic, boring sustenance. It was a literal daily miracle falling directly from the sky.
A physical, tangible manifestation of God's daily grace arriving fresh every single morning.
And as the pastor pointed out in that brilliant modern analogy, if bread started falling from heaven today, CNN and the BBC would rush reporters to the scene.
Oh, it would be a media frenzy.
It would be breaking global news every single morning. The whole world would be in awe. Scientists would study it. People would travel thousands of miles just to see it.
And yet, what do the Israelites say in verse 6? They actually say, there is nothing at all but this manna to look at.
It's just so sad.
You can hear the absolute heartbreak in those words, because the mechanics of the miracle hadn't changed. The manna was just as miraculous, just as nourishing, and just as supernatural on day 400 as it was on day 1.
Right. What changed was the internal appetite of the people.
Exactly. God's grace didn't falter. The hearts receiving it just grew numb. It highlights a vital truth about human nature, I think.
What's that?
Our greatest problem isn't a lack of miracles in our lives. Our greatest problem is that we've grown so incredibly accustomed to the miracles around us that we just label them normal life.
Yes. Waking up this morning with breath in your lungs, having a family to love, being able to gather freely with fellow believers for worship.
Having a Bible you can open and read.
These are astounding, universe-shifting miracles that we so easily treat as simple, boring entitlements. We get so used to the daily manna that we stop tasting it.
And because of that creeping familiarity, the Israelites met tragedy. It's deeply sobering to note the name they eventually gave to that place of judgment in the wilderness.
Kibroth Hattaavah.
Yeah, Kibroth Hattaavah. It translates to the graves of craving.
Wow. The graves of craving.
It reveals what had truly been sitting on the throne of their hearts all along. They weren't worshiping the God who lovingly provided the manna. They were worshiping their own appetites.
Their unchecked desires literally became their graves.
They did.
But the message doesn't end there, and I am so deeply grateful for that, because from those graves of craving, we move to the most inspiring, wondrous realization of the entire sermon.
The grace of God.
Yes. We see the relentless, unconditional faithfulness of God standing in stark contrast to our constant unfaithfulness.
It's amazing.
If this were merely a human story, it would end with the plague, right? They failed, God judged them, they were left in the desert, end of story.
That's how we would write it.
But if we look at Moses' reflection years later in Deuteronomy 8.4, he casually mentions that for 40 years in the wilderness, their clothes didn't wear out and their feet didn't swell. God never actually abandoned them.
What's fascinating here is what that implies about the very next day. This is, to me, the most moving point of all.
Tell me more about that.
Well, if you think about the narrative timeline, the most astonishing day in the wilderness shouldn't have been the day the massive flock of quail fell. It shouldn't even have been the day the plague struck.
Okay, so what should it have been?
The most astonishing day should have been the next morning.
The morning after they threw their massive tantrum.
Yes. Think about the gravity of it. After all their bitter complaining, after they severely tested God's patience, after they treated his miraculous daily grace as something trivial and boring,
they woke up the next morning and heaven opened again.
The manna still fell. Judgment had its necessary moment, but grace lasted one day longer.
That is just beautiful.
A loving parent doesn't stop loving their child just because of an angry outburst. God's covenant with them wasn't based on their perfect performance. It was based entirely on his perfect faithfulness.
He continued to feed the very people who had just complained about his food. It's honestly overwhelming when you sit with that realization, and it ties so beautifully to Jesus. Romans 5.8 tells us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us.
Not after we stopped complaining.
Right. Not after we got our priorities perfectly straight and stopped craving the things of the world. While we were in the middle of our craving, he came.
We constantly look at our lives and ask God for more, more, more. But as John 3.16 reminds us, God already gave us his greatest possible gift.
He didn't just give us things. He gave us himself.
Jesus is the ultimate manna. He's the true bread from heaven. He's the only nutrient that can actually cure a lean soul.
And understanding that completely shifts everything about how we approach our faith, our prayers, and our desires.
It changes everything.
It really does. And as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to speak directly to you listening to this right now.
Yeah.
How often do we attach these quiet, subtle conditions to our faith? We pray and we say, Lord, if you just give me this one thing, this job, this physical healing, this specific relationship, then I will truly be grateful.
Then I will serve you with my whole heart.
Right. But God is asking us a much deeper, more profound question today. He is asking, even if you never receive that one thing you are begging for, am I enough for you?
That is the ultimate measure of contentment. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week, building on everything the pastor shared with us.
I love this thought.
We spend so much of our spiritual lives begging God to take us out of our wilderness seasons. We view the dry periods, the waiting periods, the seasons of lack as a punishment.
We just want the wilderness to end.
Exactly. But what if the wilderness isn't a place of fear or rejection? What if the wilderness is actually the only environment quiet enough and stripped bare enough of worldly distractions for us to finally taste the manna we've been ignoring?
Wow.
What if the wilderness is exactly where we discover that Jesus Christ himself is the only satisfaction that will never leave our souls feeling lean?
That is such a beautiful truth to hold on to. The wilderness isn't a punishment, it's an invitation. We so appreciate you joining us as we reflected on the pastor's message. We warmly wish you a week of finding your deepest joy, your lasting peace, and your complete satisfaction in him alone.
May his grace be newly miraculous to you every single morning.